I'm building an absolute unit of a workbench with 2x4s and plywood. This improved design is perfect for any skill level and any type of woodworking, plus I've got a big announcement later in the video. Let's clear the air here. I knew it! The hose fell off my dust collection. No wonder dust is going everywhere. Let's clear the air a little bit more. Yes, this is a beginner-oriented build, and yes, you will need some tools to build a bench like this. Just because something is beginner-friendly does not mean that there are no prerequisite tool requirements. Believe it or not, it is way harder to make things with fewer tools. However, you don't need a miter saw. You can get by with cross-cutting shorter pieces at the table saw, which is more accurate by the way, and longer pieces with a circular saw and a speed square. You also don't need a jointer or a planer or a bandsaw for this build either. I use the rip fence on the table saw to straighten out the edges by nibbling a little bit off each side and repeating it until I'm down to my desired width. It's not perfect by any means, but it is much better than a raw 2x4 edge. All the carcass parts get doubled up in thickness, and because this is 1.5 inches thick and I ripped the width down to 3 inches, all the parts end up being 3 inches square, which is a nice round number to deal with. I'm gluing these parts together for strength, and the screws are only taking the place of clamps while the glue dries. Otherwise, you'd need an influencer amount of clamps to get all these glued up in a reasonable amount of time, and despite how I present myself, I don't actually own an influencer amount of clamps simply because I don't have the room for them. For the legs, I'm gluing together the parts in a way where I'm leaving a built-in half lap for the short rails and aprons to glue into. This is definitely an easy way to make a strong joint, but as you'll see later, we'll still need to cut other half laps in a place where it'd be very difficult to build in the joints like I'm doing here. You're going to end up with some gaps in between the laminations, and that's fine. It's a workbench. But if you really want to clean it up, you can add some wood filler or sawdust and glue in there, but I'm going to leave it. It's just a bench. I realize the irony of me using my bench here to make another workbench when it's likely you don't already have one. But I'm really only using my bench as a table to allow you to see what I'm doing a bit easier. I am not using the work holding capabilities of my bench at all. You'll see throughout the rest of the build that I'll end up doing much of the work on the floor, and as you can see, sitting or standing on the workpiece is a great way to stabilize it when you don't have a vise. Half laps are an easy and strong joint to make, but the only downside is that I think that the glue up is a little more complicated because you'll need a few extra clamps to get everything seated properly. If you don't have enough clamps to make this happen, you can, of course, get one joint in place properly at a time, then send in some screws to keep it together, and then secure each joint one at a time. You just have to think ahead here because you don't want to place a screw where in the future you'll be doing more cutting or shaping like I'll be doing in the future. It's a good practice to leave things long when you can, to be able to flush it up with the assembly after the fact like I did here. If I tried to cut those parts perfectly to length beforehand, I might have missed the mark and cut them too short, and a visible seam would have been apparent afterwards, which is no bueno. Oh wow, almost died there. Whew. That feels real weird on the bottom. I'm gonna stand. Well, except if you proceed to cut some more joinery right in the same place, then I guess it really doesn't matter, but it is still good practice. And this is where I mentioned before about not being able to build in a half lap. There are numerous ways to accomplish a half lap. Even though it seems crude, kerf cutting with a circular saw and chiseling out the waste is very effective and usually not super time consuming, although the grain that's pointing up right here is a bit more effort. You can also use your plunge router to remove it all, and it seems easier and quicker at first glance, but I really don't think it saves a whole lot of time, especially when you account for how messy it is in comparison and all that extra time it takes to clean it all up. I show how to do all of this and talk more in depth about these methods in the video project course that I made for this workbench. Video course what? Yes, that's right. What you're watching is taken from my new video course for how to make this workbench. Everyone needs a solid, reliable surface to work on, but the whole process of building one can feel, well, a little daunting. I bet you're constantly inundated with build plans for sale, and they can be helpful, sure, but sometimes just having a drawing isn't enough. Also, they're usually either super dumbed down afternoon builds that won't last very long, or historical designs that are really advanced and would cost thousands in hardwood alone, and very little of them include any storage at all. My course is accessible for beginners to intermediate woodworkers. It shows you multiple options for some steps depending on the tools you already own, and includes a 30-page PDF set of overly detailed plans. There's over 3.5 hours of focused instruction. No fluff, no filler, just clear, concise explanations and demonstrations, because I'm not here to waste your time. I want you to get building. This was a humongous undertaking for me, and I am super proud of how it came out and so excited to share it with all of you. Even if you only click the link in the description just to check out the product page, I'd be super grateful. And to say thanks, I'm offering a 20% off early bird sale from now until the end of January 2025. One thing I don't see a lot with more beginner-oriented workbenches is a lot of storage. There's such a huge volume of potential that your bench occupies, so it's such a waste of space to not utilize it for cabinets or shelves, or my favorite, drawers. Yes, it's more work, but it's not hard work, and having a whole bench full of drawers is totally worth it, because you likely have and are going to have a lot more tools and supplies that need proper homes for you to stay sane enough so you can do your best work possible. I'm making a simplified version of a cabinet that uses as little plywood as possible. These stretchers that are pocket screwed back to front are not only going to add extra support for the top, but they're also going to hold some vertical plywood dividers that will house 9 drawers. And not only are they going to house the drawers, but they're going to act as drawer runners in tandem with the drawers themselves, which is why I'm cutting evenly spaced grooves in the dividers and the side panels. Although easier with a dado stack, I also show you how to manage this with a regular table saw blade in the course too. And then it's as simple as screwing the dividers to the stretchers and the side panels to the short aprons and rails. As you can see, making storage space under your bench doesn't have to be complicated or expensive. Medium density fiberboard, or MDF, is an easy and inexpensive way to get an ultra flat top, and making things on a workbench with a flat top is just plain easier. This is also way easier and less expensive than making a laminated solid wood top. MDF does have its downsides though. While dense, the edges are very delicate and vulnerable to damage, which is why I'm making a radius on the corners and easing the edge with an 1/8 inch roundover bit. But because it's so inexpensive, it's reasonable to replace the top with a fresh one in a few years once it's beat up. Up until now, I've been making basically a glorified table with the beginnings of a cabinet on the inside. Albeit beefy, so far there's really nothing that makes this an actual workbench. In my opinion, the most important job of a workbench is to securely hold workpieces so we can work on them without incident, and that all starts with a vise. And I don't care what some people think, like my well-known friend whose channel is named after a road named after an important president, a vise is the cornerstone of good work holding. I like these cast iron front vices because you can get up and running without too much hassle. Every vise is different and every workbench is different, so there's always going to be some upfront work before installing, which is why I had to add some blocking to the apron. I chose this particular 7-inch wide pony vise because it's the most popular one on Amazon for the right price range that I felt was appropriate for this bench, which at this time is about $40. It doesn't have a quick release function, which I do miss, but it has the pop-up dog, which I think is essential. Any cast iron vise will need chops installed, which are sacrificial blocks that do the actual holding. This is so you don't have to worry about sawing into the cast iron parts of the vise accidentally, and you can add non-slip surfaces so your workpieces don't budge. I like using rubber impregnated cork, but here I'm using a basically free option, which is just some 60 grit sandpaper glued straight to it. But it works. I love dog holes, and I prefer them to using something like T-Track or Match Fit, and I'll explain more why in a minute. What you can see me doing here is measuring and marking to simply lay out the location of all the dog holes. You can buy pre-made router templates or very expensive jigs to do this for you, and you will achieve a very accurate layout with these things, but I'm here to tell you that is truly not necessary for most woodworkers. Yes, you can do some nifty tricks with track saws and accessories or laying things out square on your bench top, but these are just that, tricks, and I don't see them as necessary or essential to good woodworking. I went through all that trouble to make the dog holes dead nuts square on my previous workbench, and the amount of times I needed perfectly accurate dog holes was exactly 0. I was able to lay them out reasonably accurate using a ruler and the 3-4-5 method to get things close enough to square. I used a scrap block of wood with a notch cut into it to get my pilot hole more or less straight up and down, and then I chased the pilot holes with a 20mm Forstner bit. Why do I like dog holes better than T-Track or Match Fit? There are far more accessories available for them, they're more basic and therefore more robust, and they're essentially free to make. I love using regular dogs, plane stops, track clamps, bench cookies, and these little magnetic covers that prevent things from falling down in them. Some people hate drawers. I believe that those are the type of people that can't keep them organized, because yes, a drawer full of rusty, mismatched nuts and some half-melted Werther's originals doesn't help anyone. Battery powered are great until you run out of battery. But if you can keep them relatively clean, drawers can be a much more efficient use of space while retaining full access to all the contents within. And the easiest way to keep them clean is to have a lot of drawers with fewer things inside of them. Now, a lot of drawers can get expensive because they use a lot of material, and mechanical drawer slides add up quickly, but luckily for you, I'm making these drawers without any hardware, which at the low end would save maybe $100 or maybe up to $400 if you're comparing to fancy undermount drawer slides that are all the rage these days. The drawback is that you will lose the ability to fully extend the drawer like you would with most mechanical drawer slides. Drawer box joinery can be intimidating to someone who hasn't done it before, but you don't need to do anything fancy to get a drawer up and running. Here I'm just using butt joints, glue, and screws, and this will be more than strong enough. Even nails or staples would work here too. My house has the original 50-year-old kitchen, and the drawers are just nailed together fiberboard, and they're still solid. The devious thing about these drawers is that the bottoms are not just the bottoms, they're actually the drawer slides too. By sizing the bottom in such a way that, once glued and nailed, they extend beyond the sides and can slide perfectly into the grooves I made in the dividers. I also designed them in such a way that the drawer widths are all exactly the same, and the drawer heights are all multiples of 4 inches, so you can decide on how many shallow drawers versus deep drawers you want, and you can move the drawers around in the future if you don't like the layout. Now, I know I've already talked about the dog holes, but there is a downside that I didn't mention yet. Even though I highly recommend them, it's not very common to buy the magnetic dog hole plugs like I have, and inevitably stuff will fall through them like sawdust and screws. And since there's nothing in between, all that will fall straight into the topmost drawers, creating a mess when I clearly advocate for tidy drawers. So, using up some of the leftover 3/4 inch plywood, I pocket screwed the shelves above the top drawers, leaving enough room to get your arm or a vacuum in there to clean it out. You could opt to have this a bit lower for actual storage instead of drawers, but I had that on my previous workbench iteration, and I don't use the shelf there for anything good other than throwing things that I don't want to deal with in the moment. There's still a couple of issues to clear up with the drawer boxes the way they are, and both issues can be solved by installing drawer fronts. Firstly, nothing is stopping the boxes from traveling too far into the cabinet when closing, and there are still gaps around the boxes where sawdust can get on your things, and it just doesn't look good either. I know there's probably several workarounds for these nitpicky issues, but installing drawer fronts will be something that every woodworker will eventually have to learn, and this workbench is pretty low stakes. Plus, it'll look good in the end, and there's enough leftover MDF from the top to make them out of. I suppose you can go out and buy a whole other sheet of plywood, but I was able to maximize the material bought for this project quite nicely throughout to keep the overall cost as low as possible. Every drawer needs a way of opening it, and in lieu of drilling a large finger hole after just having closed it up against dust intrusion, I opted for some dirt cheap wooden knobs that'll do the trick. Applying paste wax to wooden drawer runners is commonly thought to be pretty dangerous, but I like to live life on the edge. Ow! Don't hit your funny bone. Mechanical drawer slides are nice and smooth, and you can actually achieve the same frictionless feel without those by applying paste wax to both the sticky outy drawer bottoms and the grooves in the cabinet. It just slides so easily. I always tend to neglect to do at least a few things at the time I should have done them, so I backpedaled, took half the bench apart, and started by easing all the edges of the carcass with a 1/4-inch round over bit to protect them from getting damaged. Then I applied finish to both sides of the top. An inexpensive oil-based poly works well for being able to pop off dry glue and dirt in the future. Something that I totally didn't have to do was finish the entire carcass with the same poly and paint the panels and drawer fronts, but I think it really kicks it up a notch. I have some bonus content at the end of the course to demonstrate how I use the vise and dog holes together for working with the workbench effectively, and I go over my favorite ways to organize drawers. I truly believe that the design of this workbench and its simplicity will be perfect for so many people, and I'm really excited for you to check it out and to tell me how I did with the course because it was a huge undertaking. Details are on my website and the link is in the description. I'll see you there.